Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrew Altenbach, the music director of the Brookline Symphony, and I'm here with my friend and colleague, Johnathon Pape. This next cycle in May, we are presenting the Second Symphony of Zdenêk Fibich, which is a composer most people don't actually know of, and I didn't. And I love Czech music. We've done Dvorak. I love Smetana. Those are sort of the standard composers people think of. But my knowledge and repertoire of Janacek and Fibich and Suk have all expanded, and some of that, a lot of that is because of our my working relationship with Johnathon Pape. So, welcome, Johnathon.
Thank you. It's great to be here and talk about Phoebe.
Yeah. And let's just start with you in your history and in the Czech Republic, um, before as we dive in here.
Well, I I had a Fulbright to the Czech Republic in 1994, and that kind of came about because I was scheduled to direct a Janacek opera at New York City Opera, and that was in 1992. I went to the Czech Republic for the first time to visit, to kind of get a sense of it, and to kind of steep myself in the music and the culture. And I came back, and New York City Opera, which often had financial problems, canceled the production. So I really loved being in Prague and being in the Czech Republic, and I wanted to go back. And I decided to apply for the Fulbright. Um, and I got it and had a year before I actually had to leave. So I learned Czech. My Czech was rudimentary, but I was able to speak it for the important things. And my I wrote my Fulbright so that I could just travel the country and see and hear theater, opera, music that I couldn't hear in this country, which was great. I lived in Prague, but I traveled all over the country, and every medium-sized town has an opera house, has a symphony orchestra, has a ballet company. The Czech people really love music, and they have a long history of it. I did not know a lot about the Czech Republic, or Czechia as it's now known, before I went there. Um, and I gained such a real love of the place and love of the culture and the music, and an appreciation for the Czech people, and their interest in their own arts. Because the Czech Republic and most of Eastern Europe was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 19th century, the Czech language was actually almost extinct in the early 1800s. And there was a real resurgence of interest in the language and trying to save it from the brink. There was also a real resurgence in the culture. There had always been a long tradition of music, and of course, Mozart spent a lot of time in Prague. That's where Don Giovanni premiered, um, and lots of other composers and music luminaries have been there and lived or worked there. Um, when I went to the Czech Republic in 1994, there were more theaters there than there were in New York City, which is where I lived. There were a huge number of theaters, opera companies, um, and certainly the symphony, everything was very much part of the culture. They built the National Theater, which is a gorgeous building, that was really built to honor Czech music, theater, opera. And a couple of years after it opened, it burned to the ground. And the Czech people raised the money to rebuild it within like 5 years. And it's just a testament to their love of arts and culture. I didn't know a lot about Fibich and some of the lesser known Czech composers. I knew a little bit about him from back when I was taking piano lessons. I
Mhm.
played some piece, which is probably from his collection of piano pieces.
Mhm.
Um, I played a solo piano piece that called May Night in translation. And I remember that piece, but I didn't know much about his operas or his symphonic works. But while I was there, I was able to hear, listen, and hear concerts, but also have access to recordings. Um, and Fibich was one of the composers that I particularly loved. I, of course, learned a lot about Janacek and Dvorak and Such and many others and Smetana and saw a lot of their works. Um, because Fibich is lesser known,
Mhm.
it's harder to hear a lot of his work outside of Eastern Europe.
Right.
Um,
I don't even think I didn't have any sort of access. It was you that gave me the recording of the second and third symphonies.
right.
And
And
so I was thinking of our audience, just in case the audience doesn't know, Jonathan and I, we did work together for 12 years, I think, at the Boston Conservatory, where Jonathan was the director of opera studies. I was music director, and we actually produced some Czech opera.
right,
We
kind of
certainly
the
did.
Vixen.
I did an evening of Czech song with some singers and collaborative
Right.
pianists, and sought your expertise out in
Coaching on the
like,
check.
right. But I remember you came to me with those CDs, clearly like CDs that you had gotten in the Czech Republic, not
Yes,
available in the US. So
yes.
sorry to interrupt, but
No, that's
like,
quite all right. And I really came to love both the second and third symphonies of Phoebe, but particularly the second symphony, um, because it's incredibly accessible. If you know Schumann, if you know Brahms, if you know Mahler, it's very easy to wrap your ears around this symphony.
mhm,
It's also got a lot of the kind of energy and color of like Dvorak symphonies and has some of those kind of Eastern European characteristics and colors that also make it really interesting and colorful
mhm,
and slightly different than Brahms or Schumann or Mahler.
right,
And and that was something that I really learned to appreciate when I was living there
mhm,
and going to all these little tiny towns and throughout the country and hearing concerts and seeing theater and opera, um, was the prevalence of the language and how that affects the rhythms of their music.
right,
Uh, the Czech language always has the strong accent on the first syllable, which is very different than a lot of the Romance languages. And certainly you hear that kind of heavy downbeat kind of thing in lots of the Czech kinds of dance music, like polkas and mazurkas and things like that.
mhm,
But it also, there's this propulsion that's in the second symphony that I kind of attribute to the propulsion of the language as
mhm,
well, that kind of flows through this piece.
right. I always
And
feel like it's almost like there's that emphasis on the downbeat or the first syllable, but it's not a weightiness that gets bogged down. It actually almost uses it to spring forward. Um,
exactly, it's a propulsion.
right.
Right. Right. So
Yep.
to me, there's a lot of energetic interest
Yes.
in his music.
Hmm.
Even in the slow music, which is extremely romantic and beautiful, there are really interesting kinds of movements, energetic kinds of movements throughout his piece.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about? Fibich in his life? Because it's we're looking through a lens. It's different from Dvorak or Smedna,
Right.
and he obviously is. I think the term we were talking about previously was he's an internationalist. So
Exactly.
help us understand a little bit about his background and his rise up to becoming a professional composer.
Right. He was born in 1850. So this is the Czech resurgence. The resurgence of the Czech language started in the 1840s. And that's when, 1840s, 50s is when Smetana started really gaining prominence and building the Czech language and the appreciation of it into his music. It's important to remember that neither Smetana nor Dvorak were native Czech speakers.
Hmm.
They were native German speakers
Right,
because this was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They
right,
had to learn their native language. And Fibich was born in Bohemia, close to the German border, and his father was a forester who managed the large forest wooded estates of nobility in various places in Bohemia. And so he lived with his mother and father on these estates and therefore was homeschooled by his mother until he was 9 years old. When he was nine, he was sent to Vienna to attend school, a boarding school there, which of course that was done in German.
mhm,
Um, he was there until like for a couple of years, and then he came back to Prague and was in a Czech language school, or a school that where Czech was the language of instruction.
right,
And he was there until he was 15. Then he went to Leipzig for musical study for a few years. And then he went to Paris for a year. So he really has all these different cultural and musical influences.
mhm,
And because Prague and Vienna certainly were kind of the cultural hubs of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at that time, he was surrounded by very high level music making, certainly Leipzig as well. So he was surrounded by a lot of different influences and had that in his ears.
mhm,
He went to Lithuania, was hired as a choir director in
mhm.
Lithuania,
That's with
and
his first wife,
with
right?
his first wife. He married at like 23 or something. They were very young. They
Mhm,
went to Lithuania from Prague, and it was not a particularly happy time for him. He certainly appreciated the music and all of that, but he did not like being there. And they only lasted there for about 11 months. They came back and his wife died, which often happened, just the way healthcare was at that time.
right,
And then a year later, he married his wife's older sister,
mhm,
who was actually a contralto, a
right.
well-known
Yeah,
contralto.
opera singer.
Yeah. And but it wasn't necessarily a love match. And one of the things that's really important about this later period, I mean, he only lived to be 50 years old. He died in 1900. But the last 10 years of his life, when he was living back in Prague,
Mhm,
he fell in love with a woman who was a former pupil, but she was also a very important creative influence for him. She ended up writing the libretti for the last operas that he wrote, and they had a very close artistic relationship, and it developed into a love relationship. And this was probably the first time in his life that he was deeply, deeply in love. He left his wife, and it was kind of a scandal because she was a well-known singer.
right.
He was a well-known composer. And it was kind of, this paparazzi moment in 19th century Prague. But Um, but he did have a really fulfilling time artistically and romantically with this woman. Her name was Anushka Skulchava, was his not wife, but his lover. And he wrote a huge series of piano pieces that were these romantic short piano pieces called moods, reminiscences, and
Impressions.
impressions, moods,
Yeah.
impressions, and reminiscences. And a lot of that thematic material appears in his symphonies, particularly the second symphony, but also the third, and other compositional pieces, including some of the operas, but mainly in the symphonic and tone poem works.
Mhm.
Um,
Just
and
for
it,
our Brookline audiences, I'm going to um, hopefully I'm planning to record a couple of these short pieces
right.
just so that people have a chance to hear some more of this music. So that's coming soon.
Absolutely. And the thing about these pieces are they're extremely tuneful
Hmm.
because he's, deeply, deeply in love. They're really romantic. And they're also very very much about an emotional outpouring. So again, I would say that his music is not academic or esoteric. It's extremely approachable in terms of emotional content.
Hmm.
Um, these pieces, again, became a lot of the structural and thematic material in his orchestral works. And generally, I find his orchestral work is extremely thematic and thematically unified, even from movement to movement in a symphony. And really, again, extremely approachable for anyone who knows the music of like Brahms or Mahler or Schumann, even. So I think your audience in Brookline is in for a real treat in hearing this, even though we don't often hear his music in this country. Um, it's music that very much should be heard.
Right.
And I hope that you're starting a trend.
Well, before I talk a little bit more about the second symphony, let's go back to that point because people have asked me why this symphony, but also why haven't we heard of this symphony? Um, and the I hope that I got a okay. There was like a notification on my screen. Hopefully that didn't go in the recording. But so why haven't we heard of Fibich?
So part of this has to do with the way that publishing was done in the Austro-Hungarian world
Hmm.
and in this time period. If you were published by a very large house, particularly in Vienna, like International or something like that, you got broad distribution.
Right.
If you were published primarily by a publisher in your country, whether that was Czechia or Hungary or Romania or Poland or the Baltics or Bulgaria, you
Hmm.
got a lot less distribution. You could get distribution sometimes within the eastern part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but going further west into Germany, into more Western European countries was a lot harder.
Hmm.
And so, yes, sometimes we do get some of his music, but because a lot of it didn't receive the kind of wide distribution
Hmm.
that Dvorak had, for instance, or
Right.
Smetana, we didn't hear as much about it.
Right. And
This
composers had to really work to ingratiate themselves
absolutely
to publishers. We see lots and lots of letters from many composers who are essentially sucking up to these publishers, trying
absolutely
to get their attention. And for maybe one, someone had an in. Someone said, "Oh, we should talk to you, and because of that connection they had, maybe socially or politically, it maybe gave them a step up.
Right.
Um,
And
so,
the other
and,
thing I would say is that even though his style is definitely internationalist,
mhm,
his travel happened in his early years. And the travel, like he went to Lithuania, which is even more remote, and if
right,
you will, and then came back to settle in Prague. Whereas, like someone like Dvorak was traveling
yeah,
a lot to the
right,
West, including to
United
the United
States,
States
right,
and lived in the United States for a period of time. Um, so, so he did not have the reach in his later years, and because he was very focused on Prague, because he was very focused on this this kind of love that he experienced in his 40s,
hmm
that kind of changed everything for him. There was not the same push to kind of sell himself to the international community. And I think that also hampered his being known outside the Czech Republic.
right,
Um, yeah.
right,
And certainly he also was not like a well-known conductor, or he was known as a composer and respected as a composer, but he didn't have that other thing like say Mahler did, or that gave him an opportunity to be known on a couple of different levels.
right. Yeah, some people were like our double or triple threats
Right,
in
right.
terms of their performance resume.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
And even someone like Janacek wasn't really discovered widely in the Western world until really the mid 20th century,
hmm
um, when there was a real interest, particularly in the UK and Germany, in his music, and then that spread broader. But the same thing, uh, Fibich's operas are much grander in scope, much bigger, and not it didn't travel as well
hmm
as some of his orchestral music does.
hmm
Yeah.
Well, in our last few minutes, I want to speak into the Second Symphony a little bit, just so our listeners have some things to hold on to, and certainly Jonathan chime in as you wish. But the first movement uh, um, has multiple themes that sort of intertwine throughout, but there's very much a feeling of I almost hear Rheingold, like the opening of Wagner's opera at the start of this. It feels very in nature,
Yeah.
with these horn calls, and
Yeah.
then there's this galloping rhythm that reminds me so much of Beethoven 7, actually. Um,
Yeah.
and in the score, there's a lot of moments where he writes tranquillo, and then a couple bars later he writes con fuoco. So
Right.
tranquil or peaceful, and then 2 bars later with fire. And
Right.
so we have to sort of shift quickly on a dime in those moments there. But big, passionate, melodic writing. The harmony shifts are they kind of remind me of Dvorak.
Absolutely.
I think about like his Eighth Symphony, for instance. The second movement is adapted from one of those piano pieces for sure. Um, and there's a lot of what I call lyrical virtuosity by the cello section. Not just that they have to play up high, but they have to play like
They
high,
do.
intense, passionate, requires a lot of bow control. And uh, and
Let
then
me just add that that particular piece is about that from the piano pieces that the second movement theme is based on is about when he declared his love for Anushka.
right,
Yeah.
it's a proposal. It's a proposal theme.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, and there's this one moment in that second movement where the concertmaster has to play way up in the stratosphere and holds like this long pedal tone, and is almost like this angelic halo over the rest of the group. And so you have to have a very fine concertmaster. Fortunately, we do. Um, then third movement is a big scherzo. It's very light and lively. I'm very much reminded about that propulsion idea that you mentioned. Um, and then
And
there's, yeah, go ahead.
speaking of the propulsion, I'm also reminded of Smetana, like the Moldau, that kind of
Yes.
movement that and the nature painting that that happened in Smetana, and then Dvorak took that to another level. Yeah.
Hmm. Um, there's a contrasting trio in that scherzo, which um, reminds me of like Bohemian Woods, where I can imagine him being out on that acreage as a little boy with his dad as the forester. And there's a sense of walking through the woods where it's sometimes very ominous, and sometimes there are these moments of light and warmth in the sound. And the last movement is just feels very much like this earthy, jubilant dance, and Fibich brings back all these themes from the previous movements. Um, and there's this big close where he takes the
Right.
opening theme from the fourth movement and elongates it, and that's this idea of called augmentation. So you hear the theme ba 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 bum bum very fast, and then at the end it's all drawn out slow. Dee da 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 dee da da dee da da. It's wonderful. So we're having a lot of fun rehearsing it and playing it, and so much of this is I'm grateful to you again for handing me those CDs many years ago, and our continued conversations, and I'm sure we'll have many more to come. So look forward to seeing everyone there
Okay.
at the concert. It is, I was going to say, I have to find the date. I always think it's just in May, but it's May, sorry, just checking my calendar.
17th.
Sure. 17th, thank you. May 17th at the Driscoll School, and we'll see you there. Thanks, everyone.